Hey, deserving listeners, a lot of you have been asking me to watch the new Netflix reality show called The Ultimatum Queer Love Let's Watch. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Let's see what comes out of my face as I watch.
Did I feel about marrying you?
Yeah.
I think it would be fun. What do you think marrying me would be like?
It's hard for me to imagine marrying anyone. I think that today I'm realizing I don't want to grow closer to someone else. I don't feel like I'm at that point at all. I'm so not ready for that.
Okay, so we're about halfway through the second episode, and I've been absorbing a lot and actually taking notes. There have been times when I thought maybe there was something I could react to, but usually on these shows, there's a lot more I can react to later, so I've been waiting. So to review, we have Vanessa and Xander have been together for 4 years. They met in high school. Their boyfriends were best friends. Then later on, they reconnected, well after when they were maybe 26-ish after high school, and they became a couple, and they've been a couple for the past 4 years. They're both 30, Vanessa and Xander. This is Vanessa and Lexi. If you don't know the premise of the show, there are 6 couples. One of the individuals is giving an ultimatum to the other person saying, look, we either get married or it's off. And so they come on the show, they break up officially, and then they start dating the other people that are on the show to see who they're going to match up with. And then they match up with that person, and then they spend a month basically acting like they're married. And then at the end of that month, then they get back with their partner for another month, and at the end of that month they declare whether or not they're going to go ahead with the ultimatum, meaning that they're going to get married or not. And from what we saw during the first season, the premise seems interesting, but I'm sure even the producers don't know exactly how these things are going to play out until they actually get real humans involved. And what happened in the first season is you had 2 of the couples from my memory who actually, during the declaration phase, because right now they're in the dating phase, which is this week when they're in some sort of honeymoonish sort of place, a resort. And at the end of that first week, 2 of the couples actually, they said, I don't want to break up. I don't want you to live with someone else, and I'm going to propose. And they ended up getting married, and then they didn't go on with the rest of the show. So the show only had 4 couples that were mixed and matched in that partner swapping phase, if you will. And in this show, one of the things that I've noticed right away is that the cast members are older and the relationships are more long-term. If you remember during the heterosexual version of The Ultimatum, the individuals were pretty young, like mid-20s, I think, for the most part, and maybe 30 years old, and the relationships were, on average, maybe 1 or 2 years long. And when you're talking to a 24-year-old who's been in a relationship for 1.5 years, and you're talking about an ultimatum, it just seems like it's less likely to have the weight of when you're 35 or 42, and you've been together for 5 years, and then you give the ultimatum. You know what I mean? So this show seems to be leaning more in that direction. Older individuals having longer term relationships. So it feels a lot more weighty to me. Anyway, so Vanessa and Lexi, we can see Lexi there. Vanessa was with Xander for 4 years, and just looking at my notes here, Vanessa doesn't have a deep emotional desire to get married because Vanessa's partner, Xander, was the one who gave the ultimatum to Vanessa. And we're hearing again from Vanessa saying that she isn't really necessarily wanting to move forward with figuring out if there's someone else that she would want to marry. Yeah, and I think, is that the premise where they meet up with someone, and if this other person and them really connect, then they declare engagement at the end of that? I don't know. So for Vanessa, the other one talking, doesn't have a deep emotional desire to get married. She never wanted a long-term relationship, even with Xander. She wants freedom, she talks about. She doesn't want consistency in life. She gets bored easily, she says. She also said that people fall in love with her easily, and she says she's pansexual. And in this interaction, she's now revealing. So Lexi is trying to figure out who she should be with for that month, and Vanessa is on our short list. And so right now, Vanessa is saying, well, I don't know if I ever want to get married. Let's rewind that.
About marrying you?
Yeah.
I think it would be fun. What do you think marrying me would be like?
It's hard for me to imagine marrying anyone. I think that today I'm realizing like I don't want to grow closer to someone else.
And that I could totally understand. For Vanessa, she's thinking, okay, I've dated, I think they're 2 days in now. So they've spent, I think, 2 full days dating other people, getting to know other people. And Vanessa is saying, I don't know if I want to marry anybody. And maybe Xander is the best that I could be with in this crowd. So I'm not really hitting it off with anyone. And maybe I'll never hit it off with anyone because I'm just not at that point in my life yet. So that makes sense. But I think a lot of people will get upset at people like Vanessa because what they're hoping is that they will dive into the experiment. I don't know if they call it an experiment on this show, but because during the last season, those 2 couples that got engaged right at the end of this first week were disliked by the other. There was one couple where everyone was like, oh, that's cute. And then another couple, it seemed like the way people were interpreting it was the guy was panicking because he didn't want his girlfriend who was giving the ultimatum, he didn't want her to be dating someone else. And so he jumped to engagement out of his worry of jealousy, which seemed like he was just copycatting the other. That's what a lot of people were saying. But anyway, so I wonder if Vanessa will be, people will be upset at her if she doesn't go full bore into the process.
I don't feel like I'm at that point at all. I'm so not ready for that. You have so much stability in your life, I feel like I've never had, I don't have any desire to have.
Do you think you want to be with somebody who has stability?
I'm up for it.
Yeah, so looks like Lexi is now realizing she doesn't want to be with Vanessa. And it's fine. If Vanessa doesn't want to, she's been pretty consistent from the beginning. Even before she met up with these other women, she was saying, I don't know if I ever want to get married. I don't want consistency. I get bored easily, that kind of thing. So a little bit on Lexi. Lexi and Ray were together for 3 years. Lexi is 24, and Lexi is the one giving the ultimatum, and Vanessa is the one who is receiving the ultimatum from Xander. And Lexi doesn't know if she's in love. Even though Lexi is the one giving the ultimatum to Ray, Lexi doesn't know if she's really in love. It's also seemingly that maybe Ray was accusing Lexi of this, that Lexi wants a fairy tale kind of style, that she wants it to be very magical, and that Ray was thinking, well, a few years in, it's not necessarily going to feel that way anymore. Lexi gives some indications of possible codependency. I'm not diagnosing from afar, of course, but she talks about how she's always the one taking care of others, and she's never had a partner who took care of her. And Lexi wants that. She's like, I want to be with someone who actually takes care of me sometimes and doesn't require me to take care of them all the time. And that sounds like codependency, right? Because that's what, when you think codependent, think overfunctioner. On the internet and in culture, people use codependency to refer to overdependency sometimes. That they'll use it for either. They'll say codependent people are overfunctioners, or codependent people are too dependent on each. Sometimes they'll say these people are codependent because they think that the co means like co-pilot or co-host kind of a thing where there's 2 people doing something, and they are dependent, so they're codependent. No, listen to all my deep dives on codependency. It's a pretty interesting history of the term, and it's pretty complicated, but think overfunctioner. So for Lexi, she has seemingly been in a lot of relationship where she was the overfunctioner. She might even choose people that are underfunctioners. Maybe it's by luck, because when you're 24, particularly, you might just have some bad luck up until that point. If I talk to a 45-year-old and 90% of their relationships were with underfunctioners, then I would have a greater ability to conceptualize that overfunctioner individual is actually seeking people like that out unconsciously. Whereas when you're 24 and you have a few different close relationships, romantic partners who were underfunctioners, it just could be luck of the draw. It's harder to tell. But it seems like Lexi might be in that direction.
I'm up for a trial marriage, and I want to see what it's like to live with someone who I've never lived with before.
So when they say trial marriage, that is the term they use for that month where they try out being married to someone because they live with them. So that's what she's referring to there. And by the way, kudos to Netflix for having a show, a reality TV show that has representation, particularly right now, right? You know, in Seattle, we have been, among other cities around the world and countries around the world, there are pockets of progressive politics, especially when it comes to LGBTQ people. And in my city, being queer, being a lesbian has been, you know, for the most part, there's still obviously bigots in my town, but they either have to keep quiet because they know they're going to be attacked, justifiably so, by the majority of the people in my town, or they move. A lot of bigots will move away from Seattle because they just can't stand being in a minority, I guess. So in Seattle, we've had that. But in the rest of the country, there are pockets, and you see these protests happening where they're going around tearing down rainbow flags or getting up in arms if preschool has a rainbow on it or something. And so we are continuing to progress forward with justice, with fairness, with morality. And we're trying to affect these holdout bigot pockets in our country. And so when you have a show like this that presumably maybe some of the people in these areas will watch, also there are queer people who live in those communities and are looking for some show to show them that they're not the horrible individual that their society or their religion is telling them that they are. And so good on Netflix for making a show like this. Whenever I see these shows, I always, that's one of the questions, you know, when they made The First Love Is Blind, I'm like, well, what about queer people? What about gay people? When are we going to have that? And then I think, well, how would you work that exactly? And The Ultimatum, almost, now that I think about it, is the perfect show for queer people, for gay people, for lesbians, because the show is such that you are together and there's an ultimatum and then you break up and then you now date everyone else. Well, when everyone is gay, because with a heterosexual ultimatum, when you broke up, you had 5 other options because there's 6 couples, right? So you break up with your partner and then you date 5 other people. On this show, you break up with your partner and you have 11, right? 11 other people to choose from. So there's a greater chance that you'll find someone that might actually be compatible with you, at least enough. Because that was the complaint that I had about the first ultimatum, is that it seemed pretty clear that among the partner swapping couples, none of them were compatible. They didn't have enough time to vet each other, or they weren't fully invested, you know, because you would need, for that experimental month, you would have to have both people really invested. And in order to be really invested, you'd have to really let go of your previous relationship unless you're poly. So that month where they're with someone else, if anything, I think what this show does is it just puts into sharp focus the question as to whether or not you want to continue being with your original partner. So the honeymoon or the trial marriage, it's all in relation to that original relationship, which, you know, I suppose is a good thing.
Like, I'm excited about that, but I think for me, I can't go into it thinking I'm gonna go get fucking married. Yeah, right.
And my ex,
She was the closest to marriage I feel like I could get. But I just feel like when I get bored, I'm like, okay, I'm bored.
Yeah, and I get that. For Vanessa, that's how it is for her. And she really wants to be with Xander, but not necessarily forever. And she's dated some other people, and she's not really feeling it, or at least it hasn't grown into that yet. And so for her, she's being honest about that. And Lexi is, I think, turned off by that because she's thinking, look, if I'm going to do a trial marriage with someone, I want someone to actually be invested. I don't want to just be wasting my time. And maybe Lexi is honestly shopping around, right? Because you could see that. You could see how someone would come on the show not wanting to shop around. They're just like, well, I'm getting an ultimatum, you know, and I'll give it a shot and we'll see what happens, but I'm not really shopping around. Whereas Lexi might be seriously shopping around thinking, well, you know, actually, maybe I'll meet my person. And so I think Lexi is coming from that place, and that's why she's having those faces, because she's like, well, obviously I don't want to be with Vanessa because I don't want to be with someone that's just going to phone it in.
Do you feel like there was like an actual chance that Xander could find someone else?
No, I'm beautiful.
Okay, they edited that, so I can't, I mean, they edited everything. The only way we could know if it's not edited is if they have a two shot where both people are in the shot and there's no edits. Because even when they have these two cameras, they can edit pretty easily between, they could take it completely out of context. So it kind of looked like that. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. We often talk about a work-life balance, right? But how often do we talk about a balance between time for others and time for ourselves? It's so easy to get caught up in thinking about what everyone else wants from us and never taking the time for ourselves. And of course, therapy can help you with that balance. I mean, just going to therapy is taking time for yourself, right? I've had many clients who will do this. They will come into my office, sit down on my couch, and let out a big sigh of relief because I think for the first time in a week, they're actually taking time to think about what they need. If you're thinking of starting therapy, it's worth giving a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and suited to your schedule. And also, you can switch therapists at any time at no additional charge. So, find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/Kirk today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Kirk.
Do you feel like there was like an actual chance that Xander could find someone else?
No, I'm beautiful.
I mean, even her look, it certainly gives a story right there, right? And if we go with the story that the edit is showing, and it could be legitimately what actually happened in sequence, I can't know, but it was pretty disjointed, right? Do you think that your partner could actually meet someone and then Vanessa says, "No, I'm beautiful"? Like even if you were like that, you would know it well enough to not just say it like that. So who knows what's really going on. But there does seem to be some indication that Vanessa might be in that, on that spectrum somewhere. Probably not very high, because otherwise there would be a lot more problems that I think Xander would have talked about. But it's possible that Vanessa has some issues around that. It also could be that Vanessa is just stressed out and resorting to a defense mechanism that protects her from insecurity or something. I don't know. It doesn't really look like that. But so I'll talk about narcissism. I'm not diagnosing from afar. But there are some things I can say. And I've done lots of deep dives on narcissistic personality. Almost everything that's discussed on the internet is wrong. I know that because there's a lot of talk on the internet about narcissists and narcissism and narcissistic personality. But in a nutshell, for people who were emotionally neglected growing up, there's a lot of things that would be termed or would be conceptualized as emotional neglect. You can have it be very extreme where the parents are checked out or not home very often or that sort of thing, or the parents die when you're very young and you go from foster home or you go to a grandparent's house that doesn't really care that much about you. So there's a lot of roads to neglect. Or you just have parents that were neglected themselves when they were growing up and they just have a model of parenting that is hands-off. So you can have very loving parents who you never doubted their love, and also from 0 to 3, when you were 0 to 3 years old, the parents were just a little standoffish, a little less responsive, a little less attuned, a little less knowing how you're feeling, and a little less quick to respond to that. They might have even believed, based on their culture, that they're not supposed to coddle you. That's another road to emotional neglect when you're young. So whatever the actual experience, but the child experiences it as emotional neglect. Essentially, the child will have an upwelling of a need, like I'm hungry, or I'm uncomfortable, or I'm scared, or I'm happy, or I'm bored, or whatever. And if you've ever been around young children, they show how they feel when they're healthy. Now, when you don't attend to them, when you don't attune to them, they learn to kind of shut that down or to amp it up, either direction, depending on their style of preoccupation or avoidance. But for these children, when they're signaling how they're feeling and they want to be interacted with, they want to be safe, they want things to be given to them. And so when you have a general neglect of that, the child is faced with a conundrum because they don't know what's happening. And a lot of this is subconscious and a lot of it is developed neurologically, that the child will learn, okay, I can't really depend on other people, so I have to depend on myself. And I feel very afraid of the world. So how do I navigate the world given the fact that I feel very incompetent and very vulnerable and I'm very scared, and no one is going to attune enough to me to make me feel not scared. So the child is faced, this is all subconscious, and a little bit of it might be conscious, but most of it is subconscious. It's just the minute by minute developmental process of a young child. So the child says, well, I can't depend on other people. I have to depend on myself. The world is a scary place. I'm incompetent. So the only way I can feel safe is if I trick myself into believing that I'm so competent that I can take care of myself and I don't need anyone else. And so they end up having a defensive structure that says that they are superior to everyone else, that they're better than everyone else, they're good at everything, and they have a vast sea of self-hatred and also not even really knowing who they are. Depending on the level of lack of attunement, they can have an extreme emptiness on the inside. They don't feel like they're anybody really when they look inside. People with borderline personality will often talk about that emptiness. Well, narcissistic people have it as well. They don't usually talk about it because they don't reach out for help and they feel like they have to hide that from the world. But for these individuals, they're 3 years old and they are relying on themselves. They don't reach out for help. And they are convincing themselves that they're superior. And one of the methods to convince themselves they're superior is to convince everyone else they're superior. So they're frequently, depending on the style of narcissism, frequently asserting that they're superior to other people. The 5-year-old will say, I'm better than you at running, or I'm better than you at building Lego or something. And the child will do that, and it won't be noticed that much because they're young, and kids, even just non-narcissistic kids, will have that kind of behavior sometimes, because they're stretching their wings, they're trying to figure themselves out. And so it's not very noticeable at this age. But one of the things that will be noticed is that they tend not to reach out for help. But if you have parents that were already neglecting, it won't be apparent. But if the child is in another home, that might be noticed. But sometimes it's rewarded because parents will say, they'll say to a narcissistic avoidant kid that they're very independent, that they don't need anything, they don't cry very often, they don't seem to be upset very often, and they just seem to be okay on their own. But it's a defense. They've learned after many years to cut themselves off. So they grow up, they become the way that they are, and they feel superior. They also will have a hard time noticing their needs for attachment because they learn to shut themselves off from that. They have a vast sea of unmet needs of attachment, make no joke about it. The way that I frame it for people, it's an oversimplistic thing to say, but I really emphasize this, is that narcissistic people tend to be on the avoidant attachment style insecurity, and then you have preoccupied individuals who are very overt with their vulnerabilities. And what I'll say is that underneath the veil of avoidance, for every avoidant person, there's a preoccupied person that's under the surface. And I emphasize that because avoidant people can come across like they don't care, like they don't need anyone, and that they're very independent. And there's nothing wrong with being independent. There's nothing wrong with being level-headed, but there is something self-destructive and potentially relationship destructive about denying your own needs and throughout your entire life. So the same is true about narcissistic and borderline individuals. Borderline people we could frame as being preoccupied or disorganized, depending. And for narcissistic people, you could say they're either avoidant or disorganized as well. It kind of depends. But for narcissistic people, underneath the surface of narcissism is a borderline person, someone that is desperate for closeness and paranoid about other people not really ever loving them and attuning to them. So for these individuals, they will consciously believe that they don't really need anyone, that they don't really have a need for long-term relationships. And again, there's nothing pathological about that, but if you match up some grandiosity, some superiority, you hear that they're saying they don't really want long-term relationships, that they also will talk about being bored. Actually, she's talked about that as well. Avoidant and narcissistic people, when they get in a relationship and things start to get vulnerable or things start to get kind of real, if you will, then the avoidant person will start to get scared because they're worried that they're going to become too vulnerable. And they're also worried that they're going to become too attached and then that risks being hurt. People will say, oh, avoidant people or narcissistic people are afraid of commitment. And that's not the way I would phrase it. I would phrase it as they are afraid of being harmed. They're afraid of opening themselves up and being neglected, because that is what happened repeatedly when they were very young. So they're not afraid of commitment. They want commitment. They want a relationship, but they're afraid of what could happen if they open themselves up to that. So for these individuals, they will consciously think that they are bored. But what's really happening is there's a panic going on inside of them that is saying, danger, danger, danger. You need to get out of this because you're getting too close. Your heart is starting to open up. Maybe even they do open up a little bit. And the other problem for these narcissistic avoidant individuals is they're in such a routine of denying their own needs and emotions that are definitely there, but they're denying them, that they don't signal to other people that they have any needs and emotions. And thus other people don't notice that they have needs. So for the narcissistic avoidant individual, they will start to kind of open up. And when I have narcissistic avoidant clients, I will try to get them to do that. But what will happen inevitably is that they have a whole system around them that they have convinced effectively that they have no needs or emotions. So when they start to show a little emotion, no one really notices because they're not used to it. So then the person will feel rejected again, right, and neglected again, just like they were in their child, and then they shut down. So and they'll come into session and be like, "You're stupid. I should never open myself up." And I'll say, "Yeah, well, therapy is a long process, particularly with these kinds of things." So what will happen is they'll open up, and no one will seemingly care, because the other thing is that when they open up, they might do it in such an obscure way that no one even is able to detect it. Anyway, so then they start to feel this urge to run. Avoidant narcissistic people will very frequently talk about how there'll become this moment when I just feel like I need to get out of the relationship. There'll be this sort of panic. Again, there's nothing pathological about wanting to break up, but there is something potentially self-destructive about this process, right? So it's hard to say, but what they'll register in their head is, I want to be free. I like freedom. They'll say this because they'll notice that. Because on the inside, there's a part of them that wants to connect, that wants to actually attach. But they find themselves frequently being the one that's doing the breaking up. They have 5 relationships, and after a certain point, they're just like, yeah, I'm always the one that breaks up. And they start to conclude, oh, maybe I'm just not made for relationships. Maybe I prefer freedom. And they'll also feel bored. That's another thing. And there's other reasons as to why someone with narcissism would feel bored frequently, which I won't go into. But one of the things that I will hear from clients is that they will feel bored in a relationship because emotionally they're trying to run, but there's not a reason to run necessarily. So they stay in the relationship a little longer than is normal for them. Now, best of all worlds, this individual goes to individual and couple therapy to actually get in touch with their needs, start to let those out. It's a very difficult process because it could literally be the very first time they've done it in their life, and they have all of the needs at developmental stages that they've never had met, or at least for the most part, including emotional attachment needs that they have denied at the age of 1 year old, 1 year old, or 2 years old, right? So there's a very fundamental attachment needs that have never been expressed, never been met. And so, it's possible. And I've treated, a lot of people on the internet, this is another falsehood on the internet, that'll say, you can't treat someone with narcissism. You can, narcissists don't do well in therapy. And it's just like, that's not the finding of the research data. There are complications, but if you're matched up with someone that knows what they're doing, they absolutely can recover. It takes a long time. But it'd be the same as saying, all personality disorders can't be treated. They all can, and we've known that for decades and decades, that people can recover from these issues. Anyway, so I'm not labeling, I'm not diagnosing. I just want to be clear. But I want to say that because that's where my head is right now with Vanessa. I'm hearing some things and I'm wondering. Like I said earlier, if she is on this spectrum, and there is a spectrum, sometimes they'll talk about the full-blown disorder, and then they'll say, well, you have traits. So there's basically 3 different categories. You have people don't, you have traits, and I use a percentage scale. So the disorder is someone in my scale would be on like the 70 percentile on the spectrum. So you could be 40% on the spectrum and still have issues, but it's not as full-blown and as problematic as if you were above 70%. You could also be 5% on the spectrum and occasionally have upwelling of those behaviors and those impulses. Now, the underlying pathology is lower too, so lower on the spectrum, you have a greater sense of who you are, you have more secure attachment, thinking and behaving and feeling. Anyway, so if she were on the spectrum, I would suspect it would be rather low. I would take a guess based on what we've heard so far and say maybe on the 5-10% range or something like that. So I've treated many people at the 70, 80, 90 percentile range, and there's so many things that she's done already that indicate she's not there. She could be, but it doesn't look that way to me.
Okay, I'm bored.
Do you feel like there was like an actual chance that Xander could find someone else?
No, I'm beautiful. Right?
You said it, not me.
Xander has been saying.
Now, she could also be joking. She could be saying, no, and it did kind of look edited. There's clues because her facial expression changed pretty quickly, the demeanor, I don't know. But even if she did say that in that sequence, she could say, no, I'm beautiful, and right? Thinking we're joking. But sometimes we joke about things that we want to say in a non-ironic way. All right, well, that does it for that episode. Everyone, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.